I just wanted to say good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for being here on short notice. We have an awesome speaker joining us today, and this webinar will be recorded so that we can use it in the future. And I am done speaking now, so I'll pass it over to Talina.
Hi, Squatchy. Good day, everybody. I am so excited for this morning's speaker. Dr. Anton Treuer is one of my most favorite speakers that I've heard in the area of work of language revitalization, and I'm just so happy that you could join us. Again, just a little bit of logistics. We are doing this presentation in the workshop mode, so there is no camera, so feel free to get around and move, stretch, and enjoy your time. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Anton Treuer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Koenui Ojibwe Majines Mietago the Windamunagug Ajina Awian Wagoshnin and Dugu Minawa Migizi and Dodem Wasawadio Hishkonigan Wange Bayan Gazaga Squaji Makog Minawa Niminwenda Mapaji Ijiwab and Diang Koe. Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to see you all and to have the opportunity to have this conversation with one another. I have a fairly short amount of time, and in my conversations with your team, we decided that we would use this opportunity to kind of introduce your stakeholders to some of the initial steps required to really get going with Indigenous language revitalization. And toward that effort, I'll first of all just give you a little brief introduction on me, not because that's the most important thing for anyone to know about language revitalization, but simply because nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all different. At this point in time, you know, we have a lot of stress on Indigenous languages, especially in places like the United States. You know, we're at 7,000 languages spoken in the world, and only about 100 of those are actively and widely taught at colleges and universities. So while I think a lot of people have awareness that we're kind of coming to a bottleneck with the declension of animal species with regard to climate change and so forth, not everyone has the same awareness that we're coming to a bottleneck in terms of bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing, especially as they are embedded in Indigenous languages. Anybody who's not worried about Indigenous languages isn't paying attention. And what I'd like to do today is to share a little bit about why this is important, open some room for discussion. And although with the amount of time we have allotted for the recording period here, we'll create prompts that will allow others who use the recording to engage deeply in their own conversations around this. I'm going to pull up a little PowerPoint to share with you all. And as those of you who are just joining us, feel free to open up your chat and just share what is your job or position, intersection point with this topic for Indigenous language revitalization. And as you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll get to as many as we can today. This is one of my elders, Tom Stillday. He passed away a few years ago now. He was actually the first person who was named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who was not from a Abrahamic religious tradition. So that was him with his pipe opening up the Senate. He had a great sense of humor too. He said, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." And that was quite prescient of him. I seem to feel like more than ever. But it was really interesting. We had him give a graduation banquet speech for our Native students at Bemidji State University, where I work. And when we brought him in there, I said, "Look, we've got a lot of awards to give out. I'm going to give you the mic, you know, keep it short, 10, 15 minutes, focus on the students. You know, you can throw in a joke or two." And he spoke for about an hour and a half. He did it all in Ojibwe. He didn't use a single word of English. And when he was all done, he just said one thing in English. He said, "All you people who study Indians, study that. And he went and sat down. So I was entertained, but he had some good points. Most of the books written about Native people have been written by non-Native people, many of whom haven't even spent much time in conversation with Native people. Even when we work on things like language revitalization, you know, I wouldn't presume to come into someone else's community and say, I know better than you what is best for you. Ultimately, the process that your stakeholders engage in is just about as important as the end results of what they put into a strategic plan and how they implement it. In some communities, you know, like for example, with some of the Salish languages, you know, you have very few speakers, and it may not make sense to get a full-fledged, you know, tribal language medium program off the ground in year one, because you won't have enough people to successfully immerse the students in that language. But maybe a master apprentice program where you've got some really passionate second language learners who are paired up with the remaining fluent speakers, and they can be built up over a period of a few years so that they can then launch, you know, an Indigenous language medium school. Maybe that sort of strategy makes more sense. And if someone comes in with a silver bullet solution, this isn't a cookie cutter game where one size is going to fit all. And it's really important that whatever you do is developed by, driven by, informed by, and deeply engaged by the stakeholders in that particular community. Our people have been also run over by people in positions of authority throughout the history of colonization. So people in positions of governmental authority, financial authority, you know, educational authority, and so forth. So if someone comes in, you know, to preach or just give everyone the marching orders, it often isn't going to receive the warm reception that someone might be hoping for, no matter how logical whatever is shared might happen to be. I'll share one brief story too. This is Betsy Schultz. She's another one of my elders. And in my own journey, I ended up finishing college at Princeton University and kind of terrifying my parents as I said, I am not going to graduate school right now. I'm not taking a job. I'm coming back home. And I ended up spending a lot of my time with one of our elders named Archie Mose, who was pretty much a monolingual Ojibwe speaker. And I had a real immersion experience with him. And he was an important spiritual leader too. So I ended up driving him around to various ceremonies, funerals, things like that. And it was a pretty interesting experience for me. He was born in 1901, and his namesakes were veterans from the United States Civil War. He was a teenager. First time he saw a white man, he was in his 30s. The first time he saw a black man or a car. And when I met him, he was sitting in a little modern house watching WWF SummerSlam on a TV. And I just kind of marveled at the changes he saw in his lifetime. When he passed away, I remember going to his memorial feed and thinking, oh man, I wonder who's even going to talk. Because he, you know, even in his 90s, he did most of the talking at ceremonies in that community. And Betsy, who's here in this picture with my firstborn daughter, Madeline, you know, she was one of these ladies. She was so sweet. She would kiss me on both cheeks and hug me close. And she just adored me for everything I was doing with her dad. But she also had like the perfect mean native grandma look. And she'd like shake her cane at her grandkids, you know, to whip them into line. And for the first time in my life, she was kind of looking at me like she looked at one of her grandkids. And she came over, she had tobacco in her hand, and she said, "You're going to talk today." And I remember, you know, just feeling like a deer in the headlights. And she had a line of other people behind her, each with tobacco and a bowl of food to make special requests at this drum ceremony. And so I ended up having tobacco pouches tucked between each finger of my hand on both hands, and in my fist, I had like 13 of them. And she said, "My dad never forgot anybody's native name and never forgot what one of their spiritual requests were for. I'm going to be listening." And I remember just, being quite mortified, but I stood up, I gave the invocation, I spoke through all of the requests. She kind of sat back and just gave me one nod. And that kind of uncorked one of my major callings in life, which is to be kind of a spiritual servant to our people in our area. So today I officiated a lot of funerals and various other ceremonies. And I kind of have one foot in the ivory tower. I've got a PhD and I'm a professor at Bemidji State University. I'm author of many books, but I also have one foot in a wigwam, and I spend a lot of my time in the service of our culture and language in various capacities. But as I think about that particular experience, I was really a quite unlikely candidate to have anything to say about our language and culture. This is my home, Leech Lake Reservation, which is in northern Minnesota. The Ojibwe, like a number of other larger groups, is scattered across a big geography, and kind of like Blackfeet, for example, we have communities in both the United States and Canada. We didn't cross borders, the border crossed us. And there's quite a bit of variation even within dialects of our language and so forth, which both supports and provides special challenges with revitalization. I think for me too, coming from that place, my relatives have been buried in the same place longer than America's been a country. These are a couple folks in my family tree with the very ancient face. John Smith was born in the 1700s. He died in the 1900s. He was in the state of Minnesota before any kind of white settlement, and he was there still when they were sending people off to World War I. I didn't really have the tools to talk about this when I was going to school, but it bothered me as I got older that I could go to school for 13 years in a row in my K-12 experience to learn what I needed to be successful in the world, but none of it had anything to do with me. No matter how good-hearted and well-intentioned my educators might have been, and indeed they were, ultimately the message was, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, and don't matter. The absent narratives were screaming at me. And I reacted to that with resistance to my education, which I viewed as an assimilation. I was an unlikely candidate too, to have much to say about our language and culture. For starters, my father wasn't native at all. He was a white dude, came over from Austria. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a Holocaust survivor. He spoke only German the first 13 years of his life. The short version of the story is eventually he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom, pictured here, grew up on a little village called Bena on the Leech Lake Reservation. I think for her, harvesting wild rice was less a cool cultural pastime, than it was a necessary means of survival. And my parents were as they were getting started, you could say my dad was hitting the restart button and my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. And ultimately, their experience was one of kind of triumph through adversity. Here's me as a little kid. We didn't have running water for some years. We washed up in a creek in the summer, and we had enamel wash basins in the winter. We had an outhouse. We had a little hand pump in the house. We had kerosene lanterns. My kids think it's dinosaur ages when they look at this stuff now, but I saw big changes. By the time I hit middle school, my mother had become the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota, built a nice house. The economic profile for our family changed. It revealed the power of an education. And it was quite impactful for me to see a trailblazing Native woman standing up to and in the, bastions of, white male patriarchy and stuff like that. But I'm kind of with George Carlin on this one. Like, we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. There are barriers out there, and the barriers are not equitably distributed by gender, race, and other things. At the same time, I do believe in manifest sovereignty, that we have to take the hand of cards that we are dealt in life and play those the best way that we can. And ultimately, Uncle Sam's not going to come walking over the hill with our language on a silver platter and say, here you go, sorry about the last 500 years, good luck. They don't have it to give, even if they wanted to. We have to make our own luck, and we have to take these things for ourselves and make them and build them. Also, here's my crew. I have 9 children. It is never dull. I could tell you crazy kid stories for our entire time together, but it's an important part of who I am, so it's good to know. There's home. I kind of feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. Among other things, when my folks were getting started, they'd put in a bid on a piece of tax forfeited property, and my dad got a letter back saying, you know, yours was the only bid that we received. It's not enough to cover the delinquent taxes. Can you find a couple $100 extra, and which he borrowed, and got a pretty good sized piece of property for relatively little money. It had been clear cut and turned into farm fields when he got it. And so he started planting trees. In fact, he planted all of the trees in this picture, and it totally transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. That was one human being with a child labor force, that's me, and it changed everything. And so for me, when I think about things like, how do we revitalize an Indigenous language? I think a lot of us look at that, or even climate change or race relations in America, and we think, oh, there's not a lot I can do about that. I'll try to be a decent human. I'll tell my kids to be decent humans. I'll do my little bit at work. I hope it's enough, but it's never quite enough. All that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. But it's not like we need to take this mountain of problems that humans have been making for thousands of years and like move that mountain today. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the landscape in the entire ecosystem. I have seen miraculous things happen with Indigenous language revitalization. In Hawaii, 30 years ago, their language was illegal for use in public schools, and there were only 1,000 speakers of that language left on planet Earth. Today, it's one of the official languages for the entire state of Hawaii. There are 24,000 speakers of Hawaiian. 3,000 have learned it as their first language in the home. So they've tripled the population of first speakers and multiplied 24-fold the entire population of speakers. And you can actually go to school K-12 and college and never hear a word of English if you want, all through Hawaiian medium education. I've seen things emerging strength in other places, Cherokee Nation, Akwesasne Freedom School, working with Mohawk, Paigon Institute, working with Blackfeet. There's some strength growing in Ojibwe country and other places too. Navajo's finally getting going in the language revitalization game. And no one has a perfect solution and no stress. But, you know, even like on the Lakudere Reservation, one of the Ojibwe reservations in Wisconsin, they hadn't produced a fluent speaker of Ojibwe since World War II. And today there are about 125 kids who speak fluent Ojibwe running around on the playground, hollering at each other in the tribal language. And it didn't happen by accident. And it didn't happen because somebody decided to give a multi-million-dollar gift to get them started. They just started. 2 adults, 1 elder, and 1 kid. And they got going. And they grew it into that. So no matter how strong or weak or hopeful or hopeless things might happen to feel, it is possible. And I've seen the possible happen in many Indigenous communities. It's a worthwhile effort for many reasons. There's our what the family farm looked like back in 1958, as opposed to now. Pretty remarkable. What we are doing with language revitalization, education work, also racial equity work and climate work is we are planting the seeds, and it can change everything. We do a lot of things like this. We harvest wild rice, we make maple syrup and sugar, try to get more of our food off the grid. But ultimately, there are profound challenges for Indigenous people as we navigate the rest of the world, as well as our Indigenous space. And At what point does the code switching to navigate the rest of the world simply become assimilation? How much can a people change and still be the same people? And at the same time, we have the right to change over time. The culture that we had 500 years ago, was made for that point in time. And so we need something that is adapted to this point in time. And we shouldn't be trying to out-Indian one another, having a oppression Olympics, being engaged in lateral oppression with one another. We need to be kind and loving and supportive of one another, decide what's important, and make that happen. I sometimes use this example, like if I hold up my finger and say, what is that? I really could start a fight unless we clarify the language that we're using to talk about it. Because in the language of body parts, well, indeed, that's a finger. But in the language of numbers, well, that's a 1. And in the language of space, that's up. So who's right? And they're all right. It's a matter of perspective, right? Context and language. And this is important to realize within every context, like as dealing with a tribal government, for example, what's important? And someone might be saying, poverty, anti-poverty initiatives or substance abuse intervention. And someone else might be saying language. And, they're coming at it from different angles. And sometimes we see things very, very differently. One of the problems that often pops up with any important topic is that all too often someone's up there saying this here is a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe, the rest of you, shh. And someone else is listening going, that's a 1, not a 2. See, they just don't understand. And we totally miss each other. But when we can see this as a finger, 1, up, and all the other many things that it is, having those multiple perspectives, getting really good at it and being multicultural, it enables us to navigate all the different environments that we have to in a successful language revitalization effort. Also important to bear in mind is that our people are going through a lot. We've been through a lot. I think a lot of times when you're running into another human being, half of what they're responding to is just a feeling that is evoked during their experience with you rather than the logic of what you're actually saying. Like right now, it's been a testy time with COVID, race relations, all kinds of different things. And people are just stressed out. And so half the time we're running into some sort of adversity or verbal beatdown that isn't even meant for us, right? But having that awareness makes it easier to navigate. A lot of things comprise our identity, our race, our connection to place, our language, customs, ancestor connections, economy, not just money, but like where do we get our food, education, political systems, citizenship. And all of these things are under different kinds of stress for Indigenous people. Half of the enrolled tribal citizenry lives off reservation. About 70% of the self-identified Native people in America live off reservation. Our languages are often spoken primarily by elders. All of these things, even tribal citizenship can be very contentious in different places. So bear in mind, you're going to run into that. And these things are also going to challenge the cohesion of community and cooperative effort. And languages require, more than one person, so you can actually have a conversation. So it requires collective and group effort. I think it's important too, just to bear in mind, fairness is not given. It's part of the mythology of America, but it's not part of our reality. Ultimately, we have to make the luck that we want to see in the world. If we care about our sobriety, we have to exhibit that and make that happen. If we want land back, well, then we fight, the legal battles, the court battles, the political battles, and then we also do things like just buy it back, do whatever it takes, because ultimately the right thing is not always going to be what happens all on its own. We have to make our luck. It's the same with the revitalization of our cultural traditions, languages, even safeguarding and caretaking our health. What kind of education do we want to have, and our own financial prosperity? I've got a book I can refer you to for those who want to go deeper. Although we're developing a series of talks that'll also be available to people in your network to explore different parts of the language revitalization landscape, like how to develop resources, how to do lexical expansion so you've got vocabulary to teach algebra to 7th graders in your tribal language, how to develop literary traditions for what were formerly oral languages. How do you navigate writing systems when most of our fluent speakers are bilingual? They also speak English and learned how to write when they were learning English. And so it's easier for them to kind of write how it sounds to them, which is very different from what linguists and other people want to do with a writing system that is uniform and consistent and easier to teach. So these are important questions. What kind of language revitalization strategies work the best in a particular community? Master apprentice model, immersion school model. There are many different things to consider. So this one kind of looks at, why are languages important? What's in the way? There's a personal narrative from my own language journey, and then there's a collective narrative for how we did it, and looks at some of the success stories with language revitalization, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I'll refer you to that one. And as we get going here, I wanted to take a couple minutes to just ask, why do Indigenous languages matter? And if you want to open up your chat, let's field a few comments from you. When people are looking at the recording, this will be a good place to pause and either open up small groups, or through chat, or do breakouts and discuss, why do Indigenous languages matter? And go ahead, drop in there and see what you can see. Yeah, and if you click all panelists and attendees when using the chat, yeah, it's about identity, right? Yeah, if we are assimilated with the ruling class, why do we even need reservations or sovereignty or anything else? It's connected to that. It's about belonging, right? It's about being prepared for the future. Good. Yeah, why do Indigenous languages matter? Yeah, first language from creation. It's interesting, but yes, pride. Yeah, and we can take questions as we go further into the talk too. Validating tribal ways of knowing. All right, so let's take a look at a couple. So one that occurs to me, languages matter, but it's not just because every language is a pretty bird singing in the forest and we want to hear all the pretty birds. I mean, yes, we do want to hear all the pretty birds, but it's so much more fundamental and is so much more powerful with regard to things like healing, community cohesion, belonging, educational success. I'll speak more to that in just a minute. But also languages encapsulate the unique worldview of a people. Languages embody meaning. They reflect the values of a people, but also they shape the values of a people. So to give you a couple of examples, from my own Ojibwe language, our word for elder, Gichiaya'a, means great being. Our word for a female elder, Mindumuye, means one who holds things together and describes the role of the family matriarch. In English, you got old woman, elderly woman, aged woman, hag, But in Ojibwe, you wouldn't have to say something like respect your elders. It's kind of built right in with any word that you could use. In Ojibwe too, the word for my body, ni yao, is very similar to the word for my namesake, ni-o-eh. Because when someone gives a name, they take a dream or a vision that they had when they were fasting. The body is like a cup that houses our soul. And reflected in the language is this concept that it's not so much like we have souls, it's like we are souls and we have bodies for a little while. We're not humans looking for a spiritual experience. We're spirits having a temporary human experience. And when someone gives a native name to someone else, they're taking something out of their cup and putting it into someone else's. So their body becomes a housing for, a spiritual identifier that I hold to, and we're connected that way. It's built right in. It's built right into the language. And there's so many other examples. So, because language embodies worldview, no one group of people has a monopoly on the right ways to look at the world. And there are indigenous bodies of knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing that are both valid and also critical. Colonization has been pretty rough, not just for Native people, but even for white people. They were busy beating each other up before they took it to the rest of the world. And colonization is about taking one language, culture, and operating system and group and using it to supplant others. And usually employing violence to do that. Of course, solving problems with violence creates other problems. Why would we think that all the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems can be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? They can't. We all need healing. White people need healing. Look at our men and women in uniform who win their wars and are traumatized by the results. Ultimately, connecting to ancestral knowledge, community, across generations, these things are very, very grounding and healing. It's about identity. I like the Hodding Carter quote, there are but two lasting bequests we can hope to give our children. The first of these is roots and the other wings. And I think in the modern educational system, we emphasize the wings a lot. Spread your wings, fly, go to college, do something, but not so much the roots. In fact, we're terrified and kind of tippy-toe around on eggshells, avoiding those kinds of discussions. But it's critical. This was a quote in Canada back in 1983. If you no longer speak your language and no longer practice your culture, then you have no right to demand Aboriginal rights from us because you're assimilated with the ruling class. I only throw that in there to say, if we have a hard time convincing our own people about these things, good luck convincing the rest of the world. Our sovereignty is greatly buoyed and strengthened by our language and culture. Even the United Nations, offers criteria, for what nationhood looks like and identify things like a living language, a living identifiable culture, and a sovereign land base. Our languages are how we share our history. And there are a lot of books that are doing work with oral histories. And I've written some of them and read a great many more. And it's beyond the purview of this talk today, but looking at how that can work is really an exciting discussion too. With regard to our experiences too, language is so important because it keeps us real and relevant. We have history. That doesn't mean we are history. We're not past tense. We're alive. We're still here. We have living languages and cultures. We are ancient and modern at the same time. We are thousands and thousands of years of documented human history still in the making. So another good question to ask yourselves are, does Indigenous language learning impact school or academic success for kids? And if so, how? And there's a lot of evidence around this. So this would be another good place, when people are looking at the recording, to pause and have a discussion. And I'm seeing some good stuff pop up in the chat window here too, that yes, when people know more than one language, it enhances cognitive function, understandings of language function and patterning, and it gives you access to those multiple perspectives, so valuable for navigating the world. And we're also finding out, like, if you look at, just in terms of basic academic success in America, that the top states in things like aggregate test scores, they happen to be states like North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan. They're kind of clustered right there. And those same states are the very worst states in the United States of America with regard to racially predictable disparities in education. It's kind of like the whiter the state, the whiter the body of teachers, the whiter the curriculum, the better the white students are doing, and the worse everyone else is doing. But we can't afford to have an educational system that functions like a white empowerment program. It has to be there for everybody. So things like role models, like my mother, she only met one professional Native person ever her entire childhood. It was the school nurse. So she went on to get a nursing degree, and from there got a law degree. These things matter. If you actually do Indigenous medium education, who's going to be teaching? Indigenous speakers, Indigenous language speakers, who are, 99% of the time Indigenous people. So it has big effects on multiple fronts. We're at a time, and this report is dated back to 2011, so it's 10 years old now, but 5.6% of American teachers feel prepared to work with students from cultural communities different from their own, but 100% of them are going to have to. The majority of America's students are students of color. Only about 60% of the students of color graduate high school, and only about 50% of Indigenous learners graduate from high school. And it is not a recipe for a healthy country to take the largest demographic group of students in America and only track a little over half of them to the finish line with high school. Because of the proven connections between educational attainment and financial prosperity. If we had perfect racial equity today, of course we don't, but pretend we did, our educational system alone would engineer racially predictable financial disparities. We have to do something differently. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. We have to do something different. And the data coming out of some of these Indigenous language revitalization efforts, when they're at scale and have been going for a couple of decades, are showing us that this stuff is delivering the results for Indigenous learners in a way that mainstream education never has and likely never will. Distribution of teachers, 82% white teachers, disproportionately also female educators. And there's nothing wrong with being white, nothing wrong with being a woman, but that's who's doing a lot of the teaching, who's doing the learning. There's a disconnect. So, it's really important. Like, what would happen if 100% of the educators were men? Might there be a woman, female student who had an issue with sexual assault or harassment or just needed affinity space? Well, sure, it doesn't take rocket science to figure that out. So the effort benefits when you have both men and women on the team. And when you have representation from all those different groups, when you're working in mixed company. But in a tribal context, we still have primarily white teachers, even in schools that are 100% Indigenous kids. So we have to do something differently. Another really good question to think about would be, what is my personal responsibility to revitalize our language? Do I have one? What should it be? It's an important question. We didn't make the world this messed up. We landed here. And it's through no fault of our own that a third of our people have been adopted and fostered out of our families and communities. It's through no fault of our own that so many of our people got brought to residential boarding schools, and some of them were buried there. You know, it's through no fault of our own that the survivors thought they were sometimes doing a favor to their children by not teaching them our Indigenous languages. The finger pointing now isn't going to help, but we have inherited this environment. What are we going to do with it? Do I have a responsibility? And if so, what would that be? What are my gifts? And what are the ways in which I can contribute to these things? Because ultimately, in my experience, probably the biggest barrier to really getting going with language revitalization is not the money or anything like that. It is having leadership with some fire in the belly, taking personal responsibility and making passionate effort. This is a good question to ask. It's good too, just to take an inventory with what's in the way, because, you know, some of the language communities in your area have very few speakers left. And so what makes sense and what can we do? And oftentimes there's a lot more than people might realize. It's easiest when you take a living language with living speakers and revitalize from there. But I mean, even Hebrew was gone for a really long time before they brought it back, right? So it's a good question to ask too. What is in the way of revitalizing our language? And some of these things will be very obvious and you'll be able to spit them off really quickly. We don't have that many speakers. We don't have any special money set aside. You know, our languages are not valued outside of a really tiny, you know, group of people, and so forth. So, you know, there are a lot of things here, and I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but it's an important part of the awareness discussion to have, especially as you're starting to build a team and think about what language revitalization could look like. Also, you know, language revitalization is just, it's courageous work and it's hard work. All that is needed for any language to die is for us to do nothing. The future vitality of our languages may not be certain, but they're certainly possible. It depends on the depth and breadth of our interventions to keep them alive now. Yes, and especially in places like Washington, sometimes you have multiple tribes on the same reservation. So you've got different, you know, language groups that are, you know, essentially in arranged marriages of communities that nobody chose and everyone's trying to make the best of now. And these create other distinct challenges for how do you go forward, especially if, you know, one of those languages in a confederated, you know, native polity is in a different, you know, strength position compared to others, or has more citizens in that community than others. And so it can create a dynamic in which we end up spending all of our energy fighting each other. So English wins. Yeah, a few data pieces here, you know, 6,700 world languages, 2,500 are endangered. They've got about 130 languages spoken in the US and Canada. Only 20 of those are spoken by kids. And about 4 are so numerous and sustainable because they have so many children who speak that they'll definitely be here 100 years from now. So we have work to do. Yeah, just more data points. Also, you know, America is pretty ageist and we keep everyone segregated. So the first graders hang out and spend their days with first graders. you know, the seventh graders with the seventh graders. We send all the elders to the old folks home. And so the intergenerational connection and communication alone is already broken down. And you need that. You need that for like mental health, physical health, and community health. And of course, the intergenerational transmission of our languages. We've got the proliferation of a number of major world languages. We've got English only laws. We've got right now the pushback on critical race theory and fear of white erasure and all kinds of things that serve to, you know, underfund, under-resource, suppress, and demonize our language revitalization efforts. A language like English has 5,000 books loaded into an accelerated reader program with the assessments in a computer in every classroom in America. So it's easier to teach English language literacy. How many books for your language? You know, when I got started, I'm a little older than I look, so I'm in my 50s now, but when I was getting started with this stuff in my early 20s, you could count the number of Ojibwe books on just like one hand or maybe two. And there's so many hundreds of them now. I don't even know how many there are. But we're still not at 5,000 books, right? We got lots of work to do. The need for resources. And most of our kids are being taught in a foreign language, English. English is the foreign language. There's me getting ready for powwow. You could check out the Robin DiAngelo book, White Fragility. This also, you know, bumps into the fear of white erasure, the discomfort that a lot of white people have, dealing with racial discord and discomfort. It's a good book, and I think an awareness of these other patterns and social pressures that impact our language revitalization work is also really important. I won't go too deeply into that now, but we also have internally within our tribal communities, lack of awareness, lack of involvement and commitment. We have issues with internalized and lateral oppression. It's pretty interesting. I was talking to some folks from the Seminole tribe in Florida, and they are one of the most financially successful Native nations in all of the United States. So, you know, they operate international businesses, you know, like the Hard Rock Cafe enterprise and so forth. And they've completely eliminated poverty for all of their tribal citizenry. And in fact, so much so, like Florida had a big budget shortfall for education. And one year the tribal chairman wrote a check and covered the entire gap, which got him, thank you, from the governor, you know, thank you, Mr. Tribal Chairman, sir. You know, we are deeply indebted to you, sir. I'm going to go have a meeting with the President of the United States for our governor's conference. What would you like me to put at the top of my agenda, sir? So the question I had for the Seminole was, okay, what keeps you up at night? And without a fail, every Seminole person I've spoken to says language and culture loss. I feel like a lot of our tribal leadership, some with really great integrity, others maybe a little less so, but you know, for the most part with great integrity and the best of intentions, are climbing the mountain of tribal sovereignty and economic prosperity. And my fear is that they'll get to the top, plant a flag, look around and say, oh my God, we just climbed the wrong mountain. We should have been climbing the mountain of language and culture revitalization when we had the chance. But there is interest convergence, and we do have to have awareness of how this works. So we can't expect people to meet us where we want them to be. We got to meet them where they're at and help take them somewhere. We have to demonstrate what that looks like. And that means demonstrate, do the do's, don't just explicate. If you wait for permission or support, it's not going to happen. You have to just make it happen. So like Daryl Kipp, who is founder of the Paigon Institute doing work with Blackfeet, he said, well, we love our tribe and we love our whole community. And so we're going to ask them for money. And they asked their tribe for money every single year. And in the 8th year, they got $200. But they didn't wait. They started with one grandma, one second language learner, that was Terrell Kipp, and one kid. And they kept building. And now they have, huge endowments and they're well resourced for everything that they're doing. But you have to get started. I could recommend this book. I kind of felt like I needed a thesaurus and a bottle of aspirin to get through it. But Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is quite genius. And this is stuff that is going on in our communities big time. So among the things, that Paulo Freire says is that there's a pedagogy for oppression. So there's a pedagogy for the oppressed, for liberation. And some of it has to do with awareness. So I'll say there's kind of 4 pillars that hold up oppression dynamics. And only one of those is like an external actor keeping people down, the oppressor. And the other 3 are happening inside of the oppressed community. So as an example, like here come the Puritans, back in the day, they are oppressed because of their religious beliefs. They get into boats, they go across the ocean, and they escape from the external actor who's oppressing them. Was that the end of oppression in the Puritan world? Hardly. Where was the oppressor? And the answer is they carried it inside of themselves. And then it showed up with internalized oppression. So that was like, blame and shame stuff in Puritan culture. Lateral oppression, they're being mean to their own people, Salem witch trials. And intra-oppressed group oppression, they start beating up on natives, they start beating up on Black folk, right? And so here we are as Native people. And while there is an external agent, at times, that oftentimes showing up for us will be the internal oppression. So that's manifested by, negative self-talk. I'm stupid. I'll never get it. I'll never be able to learn my language. I'm not good at languages. High suicide rates, and things like that. Us telling us no instead of making everyone else do it. It's lateral oppression. So think about tribal election squabbles, nepotismal political squabbles, whatever. Think about how we try to run each other down sometimes. And when is it friendly banter and when is it like putting people in their place? It's also, intra-oppressed group oppression. So, homophobia, patriarchy, sexism, anti-Black, and even anti-Indigenous attitudes pop up within Indigenous people, all of which serves to support white supremacy and English language dominance. So one of the things that's helpful with regard to liberation is that if there are 4 pillars that hold up oppression and 3 are happening in our own communities, those are within our power to do something about them. And navigating your own tribal government and things like that requires an understanding of these dynamics so that we don't engage in competing victimization, the oppression Olympics, crabs in the bucket kind of stuff. And so it's good to develop introspective tools as you get going with language revitalization. And one of the questions that I ask myself, and I think it's a healthy question to ask ourselves, is how am I in the way of efforts to revitalize our language? And I think I get in the way all the time. Sometimes I get in the way because, well, for starters, I'm just exhausted. I'm tired. And so then I just check out, or I'll do the minimum, or I won't lean in when I should. I won't ally myself to someone else's effort. I'll be stuck in my pet project. Any number of different things. And so, I don't think it diminishes me to have awareness of that and to even empower my friends and colleagues and the people around me to say, hey, if you catch me checking out when you need me to lean in, I want you to say, Anton, I really need you right now. Lean in, and I'll answer. And I'll do the same for you. And we kind of both support and hold each other accountable with these kind of efforts. So this is another good place, pause the recording, ask this question, develop those introspective tools that can be so helpful in launching a successful language revitalization effort. With regard to time, do we have a few minutes to go over? You want me to keep it right at the 1 hour for our time right now? So someone can drop in the chat and let me know on that.
I think that you can keep going, and then if people need to drop off the call, then they can do that, and then we'll send out the recording.
Okay, so one of the things that I'll sometimes do is just share a little bit about my own language journey, because I think we can relate to other people's stories and see some of what works. But I'll kind of skip through this, and then I'll leave some time for questions too. So here's my grandmother, Luella Seeley. She's still alive. She's 98 years old now, with my youngest daughter, also named Luella, who, and this picture is about 10 years old now, so she's 10. And my grandmother went to residential boarding school, got pulled out of her family and community and language space. Her mother was a fluent speaker and she grew up with the language and stuff like that. And so it broke the intergenerational transmission of language in our family. And, my mother was on a language and culture journey of her own, and I was along for the ride. But it was really after college when I connected with Archie Mose, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and really had an immersion experience with our language. And I think ultimately a really successful individual learning effort is going to have some kind of immersion experience. So, with some languages, you can just go to the country where that's the language and, immerse that way. Master Apprentice offers a chance to do that. My experience was a little more kind of holistic, but ultimately that's going to be an important piece of it. For me, the language and culture were very much intertwined with one another. So I remember, one of the elders I was trying to find, I said, hey, I want to come see you and talk a little bit about language revitalization. He was kind of like looking out the window, ignoring me, not paying any attention to me. He wrote something on a piece of paper. He crumpled it up, he threw it away, he wrote something again. And then finally he turned to look at me and handed me this piece of paper. And it said, and what it said was, I come to you today with all respect to ask you something. I'm giving you tobacco. He said, go learn that, come back, ask me that, and then we'll get started. And so, I was busy, memorizing that phrase and coming back to see him. And then he said, okay, we'll get started. And I started doing that with all of my elders. In our area, tobacco is kind of like spiritual currency. It's how we pay it forward. So we're not just takers and things like that. And so I remember one time I went to see Scott Hedberg, who is another great speaker in our area. He lived just down the road from me. And I gave him tobacco and I said that, and he got up and left. And I was sitting in his house and I thought, oh man, I must have said something really offensive. What did I do? And I could hear him rummaging around in the back room. I was like, oh God, what is he going to do? Find a gun or something? He came out and he had a pouch of tobacco in his hand and he said, and so he said, I'm coming here and I want to thank you for coming to learn. Not too many people do this. And I'm going to give you tobacco and I'm going to ask you to remember everything that I'm going to teach you now. Let's get started. And it just opened a door. So what are your cultural protocols and how do you center them in your individual efforts and in your collective effort? This is kind of how we make our traditional tobacco out of the inner bark of red willow. There's a lot in our cultural toolbox, and I'll probably just skip through this and save it for another talk, but it's really, really powerful stuff. The language and the culture can be very, very grounding. And so, I mentioned the Hawaiians as a really successful case in the US. The Maori are really the first indigenous group in the world that pioneered a major successful scaled up language revitalization effort, and the Hawaiians kind of modeled their efforts on them. But it's certainly worth a look. They talk about this concept of maoli, which is spiritual fire. And for them, in the Hawaiian custom, They say there are three sources of Maoli, spiritual fire. So one is the head, like sacred vessel for the soul. So it's very reminiscent of the Ojibwe, like where the body is the cup that holds the soul. For them, the head is. And then Pico is the belly button, connection to the matrilineal line. And then the genitals is like future generations. And they'll say, well-tended fires grow strong and neglected fires grow weak. Their ancient custom, you can see here at the petroglyphs, like when a baby was born and a week later, the stub of the umbilical cord falls off the belly button. They'll put that, carve a divot in the rocks and put it there, put a little rock on top. And they'll remember their spots. So then when the next kid's born, the divot goes right next to the next one and the next one. And when a girl grows up and becomes a woman and has children of her own, she'll go to her divot and put a circle around it. And then her baby's, belly buttons go next to hers. And it's pretty stunning when you go out to the petroglyphs, and for acres and acres and acres, it's just divots and circles. People bonding to their matrilineal line, bonding to the Aina, Mother Earth. And they even have cultural protocols, like babies need to stay next to their mothers. Kids can go to school and things like that, but they got to stay on their island. When people are adults, they can go out, see the rest of the world, and represent their community to the rest of the world. But that elders need to come back to their island and transfer Maoli to the young people. And so they've kind of incorporated this stuff in their schools, and the cultural pieces are really quite powerful. So even at the start of school every day, they will have everyone at the school lined up in front of the school. And that doesn't just mean teachers, but all the cooks, the janitors, the administrators. And then here come the kids, buses, straggling parents, the kids line up. And then they do what these kids are doing in the picture here. They have to sing in the Polynesian tradition, asking for permission to come in the school. And then when the staff feels they're sincere, the staff sings back. And then every single kid gets a hug from every single person who works there every single day. Aloha. Guiding value number one means hello, goodbye, and I love you. And, in the mainstream here in the continental US, we'd be saying, are you serious? 45 minutes on cultural enrichment every day? Our kids are awake in the morning. Make them do math. Until you realize that they don't have a statistically significant truancy problem there. Something's working. There's a lot more to what's going on in the Hawaiian system. I actually get to coordinate our university's Hawaiian field program, and we'll bring 20 people there, and they make us line up and sing and ask for permission to come in. And then they sing back and everybody gets a hug. And usually my students, they're college students, they're crying because they're from Minnesota and they've probably never been hugged before or something. But it is really quite impressive at how it gets everyone on the same page. We've seen success in other areas too. I mentioned some of those. And the Hawaiians are also really good about being strategic. And there's more, I'm put another talk together for your team on kind of strategic planning and some of the different avenues there. But even just, the official language declaration, signage. So we started working on signage here too. So even in my area, we've got, the regional events center and most of the businesses and the hospital, and things like that have bilingual signage. We even got it on the cop cars. Check it out. Ganawenjagang Minawa Nadamagang, to protect and serve. These things get in front of invisibility and marginalization and normalize our languages. There's a lot of work, and I'll do a separate talk for you all on resource development, but there's some really exciting applications of technology. Right now, we're working on Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe. We have free online web-based talking dictionaries, which, by the way, allow you to have multiple dialects represented in the same document, where you can click on a word and click your dialect and hear male or female speakers. So there's really a lot of potential there. Doing a lot of work with lexical expansion, new vocabulary. I'll save the how-tos on that. Literary efforts, developing literary traditions for what used to be oral languages. There's free resources like First Speakers Restoring the Ojibwe Language if you want to know what's happening in our particular part of the world, but it may have some use and relevancy for what's going on in Washington. some of our Jedi Council and Mille Lacs that have been developing new books and resources. There's more to share about them too. And the impact is really, really quite stunning. I like the Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So those of you engaged in this work, that's who those thoughtful, committed citizens are. I really believe in language revitalization, but I believe in all of you to do the work too. So with that, thank you so much. And I'll field a few questions. I know some of you have to fly right now, which is just fine, but we can have a little discussion before I jump off the Zoom. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was incredible. So I'm just going to copy and paste some questions to you in the chat.
Yeah.
And I think that might be, here we go. So here's one.
Yeah, so the question is, what about a language that, you know, there are no documented speakers in that particular community? And so that doesn't mean that there's no hope. That does mean that there's been, you know, a huge change to the community language fabric, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to do. So it really depends on the language, like even within, you know, the whole, for example, like the Salish language family, it's a big one. And not all of the communities are in the same situation. And you have to have conversations with your local stakeholders about what really matters. You know, like English and German are from the same language family. You know, if we taught everybody German, would it feel the same? I don't think so. You know what I mean? So just because something's in the same language family doesn't mean that it's the same. But at the same time, sometimes something is really similar. So if your first grade student's teacher was from New Zealand and speaking with a New Zealand accent, would you tell them that they needed to be fired because they didn't know what they're talking about? Probably not. Like, you know, so if you have a very close dialect, then, you know, maybe you work collectively and collaboratively with other people that are closely related. And then there are reconstructive efforts. So this is going on, for example, with Wampanoag. Someone just won the MacArthur Prize a few years ago, the Genius Award for work with Wampanoag, where they were looking at, you know, all kinds of, you know, texts and written material and trying to reconstruct a grammar for this language that, you know, they really don't have fluent speakers for. And the reconstructive program, although it'll never be the same, honestly, Hebrew, the way it is spoken in Israel today, is not how it is when it was spoken as the everyday language 2,000 years ago, but it is something distinctive and central to identity. So those are important discussions to have within that community. What would meaningful language work look like here? And rather than impose, you know, an idea from an outsider, you know, it might totally go sideways. It really has to come from that community. So I still think, you know, having that conversation with that community, what would, you know, culture and language revitalization, what could that look like here in a way that would be meaningful, authentic, you know, and distinct for this place, and see what comes up.
Thank you for that. I'm going to toss you another one in the chat.
Yes, do we have a name for Haudenosaunee people? Yes, we do. So in Ojibwe, Nadawe is the word we use actually for all of the Haudenosaunee. And then, you know, of course, there are many different groups, initially 5, and then, you know, after the Tuscarora joined a 6th group that are part of the Haudenosaunee group. And then within the whole Iroquois language family, there are many different tribes. So for us, you know, Nadawe is applied to all of the Haudenosaunee people. And then, you know, usually there's a word that describes geographic representation. So like the Oneida of Wisconsin, you know, there's specific words for them and others too. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then I only have one more in the Q&A, but I will invite others. If you do have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, this one's the last one.
Mm-hmm. In the language, is there another life way and story that needs to be told if we're going to survive as human beings? And how do we as allies help preserve the old languages? Well, yes, I think, I spoke a little bit to the ways in which a language encapsulates the unique worldview of a people, and that's certainly true, but also embedded, in the language and in our oral traditions are, formative stories and bodies of knowledge about who we really are. And yes, I think that's really critically important. On the one hand, as I mentioned, we have permission to change over time. We don't have to look like we stepped off the set from Dances with Wolves to be authentically Indigenous, but at the same time, if you look at like a third generation German immigrant to the United States of America, they might go to Germany and have a nice vacation, but feel at home when they come back to, the Northwest. There's a difference between having German DNA and being a Deutschlander. The DNA does matter, but the connection to place, language, culture, and customs matter too. So while we do and will actually need to evolve our culture, for example, to fit this modern age, ultimately, there's a tension between cultural continuity and cultural change. And we actually need both. And it's hard to navigate, but language preservation, the old language, like that's the cultural continuity. That's being recognizable to our ancestors. That's preserving a cultural toolbox and a sense of community and communalism, which is very different from the individualism, materialism, and competition of the mainstream. And at the same time, we're going to need cultural change. Like if we're not going to kind of go Amish and try to freeze our language and culture at a certain point in time and wall ourselves off from the rest of the world, if we're going to be in this modern world, then we need the TV and the computer and the Xbox to be speaking our languages too. And if we don't do that, then we're saying our language is only good for prayer, rather than for everything in our lives. But there's nothing we can't do in our languages if we put our minds to it and make a commitment to doing that. Yes, how do you deal with bureaucracy that can get in the way of language revitalization? Indeed, it can. There are many, many barriers. And so, the systems that are out there can provide huge barriers, and they can also provide huge supports. So we don't get a blank canvas to just make the world the way we want it to be, but we do get to paint on the canvas that's there. So I think it's important to make careful decisions about which bureaucracies you need to engage with and which ones to avoid. And a lot of times there are pros and cons with any decision. Like working with a tribe can be so beautiful because that's our tribe, that's our community. That's, they can also, when they're really lined up, provide tremendous social, political, and even financial support, can help with grant writing, all kinds of things. And because there's in many places a 2-year election cycle, whoever was just supporting you can get voted out, recalled, someone else is in and they got totally different priorities and they can kill it right when you're getting going. So tribes can be our greatest supports and where great dreams go to die. It's both. So it doesn't mean don't ever work with a tribe, but it also doesn't mean just hang all your hopes on that one effort and see what happens. You have to be wise and measured and thoughtful, and then you pick, what looks best in your particular situation and environment. And I've seen language efforts succeed, and I've also seen them fail, organized all of the different ways. Organized as a tribal-led initiative, as a nonprofit initiative, as a charter school chartered through a public school system, as a charter chartered through a Bureau of Indian Education tribal school. I've seen all of those work and also fail. So, and they all had bureaucratic hassles and hurdles. So you have to get wise and informed. Also, like immersion can just be a buzzword. people call everything immersion, but they're not really using the language as the medium of instruction. It just looks good for a grant. So, really thinking about what do you want and how do you want to get there? Developing the plan and the path and having good contingencies and developing a team that's aware of things. Like, honestly, one of the schools, I'm on the school board for Wadugudading Ojibwe Language Institute. And, they make sure that their entire staff is trained even in things like immersion teaching pedagogy, so that they're actually able to deliver the goods. Lots and lots of stuff to do. Yeah, with the expansion of broadband, let's provide a compendium of speakers and ways of understanding regional dialects. Yes. So, I'm saving this stuff for another talk, but there's nothing like a dialect war or a writing system war to derail an emerging language revitalization effort. And we've got some tricks. A lot of times we've worked, for Ojibwe, for example, we work with multiple dialects, and sometimes the dialect variances are really significant. And so instead of saying, let's pick the word to put in the dictionary, it's if we get 2 words for the same thing, we'll put both words in the dictionary. And we can document, sometimes we work with 7 different dialects all at the same time without confusing people. We just document either on word list by dialect or code things within entries so that multiple dialects are represented in the same texts. And it gets everybody working and on the same page and not fighting over, whose version is going to win and derail the whole effort. So there are a lot of different ways to go about those things. And yes, the technology is incredible. Like, when you really get it working for you, it can really deliver some incredible success. So certainly, like, I was down in New Mexico at a training one time, and a friend of mine, Joe Erb, he does work with Cherokee. He said, check this out. And so he was using Skype. So this is even before Zoom had kind of blown up, but he's used Skype, and he Skyped in with the immersion program in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and he's talking to the kids. Then he said, hang on just a second. And then he Skyped in with the program in North Carolina, like 1,000 miles away. And then the kids were singing songs to each other and things like that. And we were sitting in New Mexico partaking in the whole thing. And so those things are really powerful. You can do everything from reading buddies. The technology can bridge time and space. And that was really what I was telling the folks in Mille Lacs when we got going with the projects there. I said, let's take your remaining speakers and let's set them up to teach people for hundreds of years to come. And so we ended up developing, Rosetta Stone and a bunch of books and things like that. And it's really pretty powerful what the tech can do. It can be a great friend. And once in a while, someone will be like, write it down. We never used to write that down. And I'm thinking, did you really drive over here in a car to make that complaint? Like, I guess I've been a fan of using tech, but you have to meet your community where they're at. So like with the Pueblos, they, for the most part, been a little more insulated and said, I'm not even sure we want our languages taught in schools. We want people to come to the community, which has strengthened some things and made it harder to proliferate access to the language for others. So there are trade-offs, but your community, you want a community conversation, and then, demonstrate, don't explicate, go for it. Okay, I'll let you all fly, but this is just to get started and to be continued. So we will do much more work together. And I really appreciate all of the efforts that all of you are making. Good luck with all of them. Miigwech, thank you. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, free Ojibwe language resources, resources for teachers, and more. Miigwech.